Thank you so much for being here. It's great to see such a great crowd tonight. I'm Cheryl Landrew, and along with Walter Isaacson, I'm the co-chair of the New Orleans Book Festival at Tulane University. Many of you were here for our 2022 event, and it was pretty spectacular. I think you'll agree. But this year, I think we're going to exceed those expectations. I want to thank all of the staff and the volunteers and the sponsors who have keep this event free and open to the public, which is very important to us. I also want to thank our first guest, Michelle Miller and Attorney General Holder, who gave a very powerful conversation. So I've always believed in the power of books, and I think we could see that here tonight. Books have an ability to inspire us, to allow us to create, to innovate, to dream, to think, to explore. And I think our next guests tonight really exemplify that. So please help me welcome Bill Gates and Walter Isaacson.
Bill, thank you so much for being here. I have all my students here, and we just got up to the section, the history of the digital revolution, when he invents the software industry. But we won't go there right away, because you have two books out, one on the pandemic, how to prevent the next pandemic, and the other on what to do about climate change. I want to start with climate change. You just came back from India, which keeps building coal power plants and doing things. What do we have to do in India, and what do you learn from India?
Well, India, they deserve to build more shelter, have more roads, and get to a lifestyle, maybe not all the way to the level of energy consumption we have, but they will use a lot more energy. And so the question is, can we make that energy in a clean way? For now, the economics for them are very much to keep using the coal plants, although they have started to build quite a bit of solar energy as well. India's kind of paradigmatic in that if you can make doing it the green way cheap enough, then India
so it's a way, if we can figure out how to make it cheap enough for India, we can solve this problem.
That's right. We have to get the cost of all the areas of emission, of which there are many, all of those we have to invent our way so that the clean approach doesn't cost more.
When did you get interested in climate, and how?
Around the year 2000, when I started the foundation, I was traveling in Africa quite a bit. And at that point, I seeing how little electricity they had. They actually have less per person than in the past because their population has grown faster than their available electricity, and it's about a 20th of what we have. And so I was thinking, okay, we need to electrify the continent, and what is the constraint? What might make it hard to do that? And so I was lucky enough to have a couple of climate experts organize for me 4 or 5 times a year, other experts coming in and teaching me various aspects of the problem.
You just became a grandfather. Wow, congratulations.
Thank you.
Just recently. And I'm wondering how that lens affects you, not just personally, but as you figure out your philanthropy and climate issues.
Well, climate is a problem that just gets worse over time if you don't do something about it. And so in fact, if you live in the United States, the negative impacts over the next 30 years are not extreme. They're bad, but not extreme.
We live in New Orleans, so we get it first.
Even without climate, the fact that there's a challenge in New Orleans is not just because of climate. Climate adds to it, but the subsidence was going to be a huge problem in any case. Anyway, having a grandchild, you get to say, okay, that's the person who's related to me that will live in the world that will either avoid that problem or not. So it kind of makes it a lot more real.
If we're going solve this problem, we need to do it hand in glove with China. And for some reason, we seem to be spiraling into a weird not just competition, but confrontation with China. How can we keep our eye on the big problems, such as solving climate? And are you worried about our confrontational attitude towards China?
No, I'm certainly concerned in a broad sense, because there are many things in terms of innovation and climate innovation and drugs that the two countries ought to work together. Innovation in both countries is good for both countries, and we're very entangled, not just economically, but a lot of talented people who are born in China are, here in the U.S. doing super important work. And so any notion that, let's disentangle, that's really going to be problematic. Through my climate work, which is called Breakthrough Energy, I have 100 companies that have new climate-related technology. And so helping them figure out how to partner in China to get new ways of making cement and steel deployed, it's going to be very tricky because of the bad relations between the two countries.
One part of the bad relations, we were just talking about it backstage with President Fitz, is this notion that we're in a competition and it's a zero-sum game. You understand economics better than most people. Why is it not a zero-sum game if we're competing with China?
Well, economics is the positive-sum game. The fact that they have made cheap furniture, electronics very, very effectively, that's been a huge part of the increased living conditions worldwide, including in the United States. The biggest market for lots of American companies is selling into Asia and to China in particular. And so a lot of our high-paying jobs, pharmaceutical, software, movies, jet engines, they get immense extra capability in terms of hiring and R&D because of the scale of the market they get out of China.
You mentioned Breakthrough Energy and all the companies you're involved with that are very innovative. One of them that's always interested me is TerraPower, which is going to help create safe nuclear energy, which has got to be part of the mix. Why are TerraPower's generators safer?
So the original design that goes back to the 1950s of nuclear power generation is a water-cooled plant. Mm-hmm. And the initial water-cooled plants were actually pretty economic, but then they kept making them more and more complicated. If you use water to cool the plant, you have to have a lot of high pressure. And everybody always knew that was not really the best approach. Using a sodium-cooled a metal liquid for the cooling means that you don't have to have any high pressure, and you completely avoid the problems that were caused explosions at both Chernobyl and Fukushima, which is that even once the reactor shut off, it's still generating a lot of heat. And if you don't have any electricity there to help you run fans and things, a water-cooled reactor is going to melt down. A sodium-cooled reactor, your heat pool can absorb all that. So that problem just doesn't exist at all.
But as you're doing it, one of the things we need is a better grid. We need transmission for all the electricity. I know you were at the White House, in fact, Mitch Landrieu, and you were talking about permitting reform, getting the grid upgraded. These are not incredibly sexy issues, but what were you, Joe Manchin, and others trying to do?
Well, the IRA, that new bill,
Inflation Reduction Act,
creates huge incentives to build green energy production, both electricity, green hydrogen, a lot of things. But unless you can hook up those new sources of energy, then you're not going to get paid for it. And so the delays, we are building the grid at less than a fifth the speed that we need to in order to have a green grid by 2035, which is a stated goal of the United States. And there hasn't been enough reform that that's going to get sped up much at all. And so people are talking about, okay, what would it take? When you have intermittent energy, it requires a much bigger grid because you can have the entire Midwest be shut down. The wind can all shut down if you have a cold front just sitting there. And so then you have to pull lots of power in. If it's windy there and not other places, then you have to move a lot of power out. So today power doesn't move very far because you put the coal plant or the nuclear plant fairly near to where the load is. Here, you don't get a choice. The wind in the U.S. is off the coast and in the middle almost entirely. And so you have to move power on average like 1,000 miles instead of today, which would be less than 100 miles.
You know, we're having trouble building new transmission lines and even building new factories. There's sort of a thing in America now that almost anybody can stop a project. How would you push so that we could build more factories, build more transmission, and not have it get caught up in those who want to just stop any progress?
Well, there are lots of reviews in terms of your effect on wildlife or things that should be done. The view is that you can build a database of where the sensitive areas are.
Right.
And so instead of having, say, 6 federal agencies involved, you can assign the overall thing to one. And a lot of that's done in advance, where you know what the tough areas are and have sort of pre-cleared capability. But balancing, all the concerns that go into, okay, should we allow this thing to be built? Somebody at the end of the day has to be in charge of, say within a year or so, bringing all of the pluses and minuses together. Today, you can end up taking a decade before you have everything clear, and you have this uncertainty. So all your upfront planning money has to be just super expensive money because of the time and risk involved. And it means that everything you build in America, roads, factories, transmission, is just way more expensive than building in most other countries.
When I read your book the first time, I thought, you're in favor of solar, you think solar is important, but you're not as enthusiastic about solar being a panacea. Why was that, and have you changed a bit? Do you think solar is perhaps going to be more part of the solution?
Well, solar is fantastic. We should build solar as fast as we can, and that will be limited by permitting the land for the solar field itself and for the transmission. In fact, in the Breakthrough Energy portfolio are companies that are going to take solar efficiency from about 24% today up to like 43%. And so this next generation of solar panels will be even better. Mm-hmm. So solar is a huge part of the solution, just like wind is. It's very tough, though, to go to anywhere near 100% of your generation being weather-dependent sources, because it means when you get the toughest weather conditions, you're just not going to have enough electricity, and storage will never be cheap enough to, say, store a couple months of electricity to have available.
Yeah, that was in the book pretty much, that the storage may be the limiting factor. But don't you think we could have a breakthrough in batteries with materials technology?
It's important to remember there's 2 applications for batteries. One is transport, particularly passenger cars. And there, we have gotten down, various lithium-ion technologies have gotten down below $100 per watt hour. So that, and there's another factor of 2 coming, maybe another factor of 3. Then you get to some pretty fundamental limits. To have batteries for the grid, the scale involved is over 100 times greater than powering all the passenger cars. And so that's where, if the city of Tokyo today bought batteries to handle 5 days of, say, a typhoon, it would cost over $500 billion. So even a factor of 4 or 5 improvement won't let you rely solely on energy storage to deal with the intermittency. You have to have something like nuclear fission, fusion, geothermal, something that is not weather dependent.
Nuclear fusion, is that something we're really going to get?
Yeah, there's 16 companies now, and in the last 3 years, about $4 billion has gone into those companies. The biggest amount of money went into an MIT spinoff called Commonwealth Fusion Systems, CFS, that they plan to have a reactor in 10 years. Now, people are appropriately skeptical because they're pioneering a lot of things, but when you have 16 companies taking somewhat different approaches, if you give that industry, say 20 years, the likelihood of that being an option, I'd say, is pretty high.
The biggest problem that I didn't know about is that so much of the energy we need is not for driving our cars or even flying our planes or whatever. It's like making concrete, making steel. And that one seems to be the hardest to find solutions for, right?
Yeah, industrial is hard. I mean, the food system is hard, and certain parts of transport, like planes, is hard. But industrial is probably the one that people are the least aware of because, making those materials is such a solved problem that most people, couldn't even tell you, hey, how do you make steel? And what is so magic about steel? Why do we use so much of it? The price has gotten very low, likewise for cement. Here, we need a very different production process. So a lot of smart people have gone back to work on steel and cement and invent those new processes.
Oh, you say agriculture. Obviously, beef is a big problem. And I know you've invested in some companies that are artificial beef. But I'm going to call you out a bit because every now and then I see you at an event and you order out a hamburger from Jack in the Box or McDonald's because you just can't resist. How much have you been able to reduce your meat consumption, and how important is that individually?
I still have a fairly high meat consumption. I do try out the Beyond and Impossible and the other artificial products, which are getting pretty good, and I think they have a roadmap both in terms of taste and cost that gives them a chance of being mainstream. They're not today. In fact, the sales actually went down year to year. There was a kind of a flurry of sales, and it's been tougher. Some of their products, like the chicken, sausage, actually that you cannot tell the difference, and so those categories are doing fairly well. I spend a lot of money to offset all my emissions, at a very high cost per ton.
Well, you say high cost per ton, and there is rightly in some ways laughter, which is like buying, we're a Catholic city here. People say, I'm going to do what I want in Mardi Gras and then just buy indulgences from the Pope or something. Or to what extent is offsets just making people feel good by buying indulgences, and to what extent are there real offsets as opposed to sort of the greenwashy type?
Yeah, so the way you can tell is to look at what you're spending per ton. And there's a whole group of so-called natural offsets that often involve, saying, okay, we'll go plant trees. Those are by and large fake. If you're spending up in the order of $300 a ton, then you can fund, like I do, Climeworks, which is literally taking the CO2 out of the air in Iceland and injecting it into a geological formation where it will stay for over it's mineralized, and it'll stay there for over 100 million years. So real offsets are actually quite expensive. Now, there's technology improving this direct air capture, which is what Climeworks does. There's a chance you could get as low as maybe $50, $60 a ton. And
that would be a game changer, right, if you had direct air capture?
It's sort of a game changer. Remember, we have 50 billion tons. So if you have no reinvention to reduce emissions, you just go for brute force direct air capture. That's 2.5 trillion a year that you're spending to capture 50 billion tons at $50 a ton. So that's very expensive.
Well, at Tulane, there's a clean energy programs, and from here to Baton Rouge, with a lot of the petrochemicals, they're trying to figure out how to move to direct air capture, many things that could sequester carbon. What do you see in terms of the technology that's hopeful there?
There's quite a few direct air capture companies. Breakthrough Energy is in 4 of those. There's people who use solid capture, what are called zeolites. Climeworks does that. There's liquid capture, carbon engineering does that. And then there's a variety there's one that's an electrical phenomena that actually captures the CO2. So many different ways of going about it. They'll compete on a cost per ton basis, but you hope that you only have to use that approach for maybe the final 5 or 10%. If you only have to use it for 10%, then it goes from, $2.5 trillion to $250 billion. It's a little more tractable. The biggest thing will be like you do with the passenger car, where you make all your electricity with zero emissions, and then you have passenger cars tap into that form of energy. Now, it means we have to, the grid has to grow because you're taking the energy from hydrocarbons and you're replacing it with electricity. There's no free lunch. And so you have to have 2.5 times as much electricity in the United States to go green as you had when we were just burning natural gas to heat our homes, burning natural gas in industrial processes, and to make electricity.
In 2015, you warned that we could be hit by a pandemic. The Munich Security Conference, which is usually about intermediate range nuclear weapons and things, you said, no, if somebody's going to get huge wipeouts of deaths in this planet, it's going to be a pandemic. We didn't really prepare for that. What do you think we should be doing now in terms of preparing for the next pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, it's a shame that we really weren't practicing what needed to be done. And so, it went global, and our death toll, global death toll was over 20 million lives lost. It could have been a lot worse. This thing killed 0.2% of the people it infected. And you can have things like Spanish flu was 4%, smallpox would be 30%. So way, way worse. If you look at the deaths per 100K in world in data, you'll see there's about a factor of 5 difference. Australia is a factor of 5 lower than the United States or France or most of the rich countries. They rolled out diagnostics at scale very quickly, and it made a huge difference that they were able to hold back infection until you had vaccination.
In other words, tests. Everybody could test real fast.
That's right. And then they had policies to quarantine people who were infected. So in that exponentiation of infection, they moved fast enough to catch it early.
But they didn't do lockdowns, right? They mainly did quarantines of infection.
If you catch it early and you're testing like mad, then you don't need as many lockdowns. They had a few in Melbourne and things, but they had way less than we did, and they have fifth the death. So early action, which meant that by April 1, you would have had to have a plan in place to test about 10% of the population every week. And no agency of the government, felt that was their responsibility and got the private sector, which is these PCR capabilities, and brought that to bear. There were people like myself calling the government saying, hey, who's going to jump into this? So quickly catching the outbreak and avoiding the geographic spread and that exponential growth, that's what you need to do. And so you need to be sampling the environment, including sewage. Turns out sewage was fantastic for COVID and will work for all the pathogens that we worry about would show up in sewage. So we'll do better surveillance. We'll have the ability to make fantastic diagnostics very quickly. And so those things are happening that the foundation and others are funding. What we need, though, is a team that's never distracted from being ready and trained and even practicing every few years like they do for war games or fires, and making sure they understand how the pieces...
Sort of a volunteer, or not volunteer, but a fire militia, that sort of said, and you called it GERM, which I can't remember what it stands for.
Global Epidemic Response and Mobilization.
Okay, I was just testing to see if you could remember. But the reversed... all right, let me go on a rant for a second, and then you correct me where I'm wrong. And my rant is this. The Centers for Disease Control was the gold standard, and it really is decent people there. However, when this all happened, There's so much data that we didn't get and information we didn't get that people are still confused about whether mask mandates should work or not, or whether or not, vaccines. Why didn't we have better gathering of data so anybody who had COVID, or at least a big sample of people who had COVID, be known? Were you wearing a mask? Were people around you wearing a mask? What vaccine did you have? When did you have it? And I still can't find the data that would make it absolutely clear that this type of mask wearing or this type of thing solve things. Data seems to be the most crucial element, and we didn't do it right. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Well, the CDC is a fantastic organization, and everybody expected they would do well. They did poorly, and then the administration they were in hamstrung them from actually getting their act together. But they were thinking of using public labs for testing. They did a test that didn't work. They wasted all the key time. They actually made it harder for commercial people to register their tests. When we were showing that the swab would work, that you didn't need to go super deep, and that you could self-swab, they made us prove that for every independent test. So nobody was a full-time person thinking through, when this thing hits, what are we going to do? Which regulations do we have to get rid of? How do we communicate? Australia, partly because they'd had the SARS-CoV-1 scare, they literally had the phone numbers of the PCR companies ready to go. And they were like, okay, we had this fire drill. That one, because of the nature of the pathogen, didn't cause widespread infection. It died out, although it got to 11 countries. This one was far worse, and we had no one who practiced, no one is ready, and even to this day, if you say who in the U.S. government's in charge of diagnosing 10% of the population every week, nobody knows. Is CDC supposed to do that? Is ESPR? Is FDA?
Or local? We have a state and local tend to be in charge, which makes it harder to aggregate the data, right?
Yeah, no, the data thing was a challenge. And, masks, we did screw up at first. What we told people, hey, don't take the mask because the medical personnel need the masks. That was a huge mistake. So people got confused. Also, when the vaccine came out, there was a hope that if you were vaccinated, that you wouldn't get infected and pass the infection to other people, that the vaccine would be infection blocking. Because it's not infection blocking, it meant we continued to have spread. And so you benefited yourself in terms of avoiding severe disease and death, but you didn't really benefit other people because you still were part of transmission.
You're very involved in K through 12 education as well as health. Do you think we made a mistake, in retrospect, well-intentioned mistake, locking down schools and people, kids not being able to go to school for a year?
Oh, absolutely. There was a period where locking down the schools was the right thing, and then you had to sort out, okay, for teachers who have a health condition or above, say, 60, do you make a provision for them so that, they have a choice of opting out because they are, as you get up above 60, you start to have meaningful risk. And, so there were lots of locales where everybody wanted the school to resume, and it wasn't resumed. And now we have many deficits, including fiscal deficits, that were created by the pandemic. This education deficit is gigantic, and it'll take us almost a decade before we.
It also seems to have increased the divide, because I assume your kids in many places could do remote learning a lot better than other kids. So.
Oh, absolutely. It was the worst for those, who didn't have a good internet connection. They didn't have space to do that kind of work. They didn't have teachers who were trained to do that. So, private schools, many of them, the learning loss is about zero. But as you move down into the inner city schools, the learning's loss is as much as 2 years.
Many years ago, you and I were on stage together. We talked about remote learning and virtual learning. And you gave a big shout out to Sal Khan's Khan Academy, and you said you were using it, kids, learning from it. I do remember Ann Dorr, who was on the board, was like sitting in the front row texting Sal Khan saying you're getting a shout out and stuff. But why is it that virtual learning and that hasn't really taken off? I mean, people want to come to a campus.
I'd say at the college level, there is a lot of online learning taking place where the lecture part of the learning, you're able to pick the time that you want to do that. And, whether there's some in-classroom component to the course for the discussion or other things, the lab, a lot of courses are, some piece of them are done remotely. Now, college students are supposed to be mature enough and motivated enough that you don't have to put them into a room. As you get to lower grades, the percentage of students where online learning works well goes down quite a bit. Now, maybe if we can make the online material more interactive, more engaging, we can solve some of that. But today, high school and below is best done in person.
Well, my lectures are all online. In fact, it's been a YouTube thing. And the lecture, I'm going to take you back for our history class here. The lecture that was this week they were supposed to do was you and Paul Allen, when Paul Allen finds Popular Electronics at the Harvard out-of-town newsstand, brings it to your dorm room. I want to say this quietly. You drop out of college, which is not something you'd recommend necessarily, but and say, this is happening without us. And you created something that was totally new, which is the notion that there could be a software industry. How conscious was that you were inventing a new industry?
Well, reasonably conscious. We didn't know that it would end up being, this big, gigantic company. But I was good at software. I wasn't good at hardware. And Paul a little bit said, maybe we should make a personal computer. And I was like, hey, do you want to compete with the Japanese and IBM? No way. What would our advantage be in that? And software had not been very valuable. IBM basically gave their software away with their machines at that point in time. And there were very, very few companies that wrote software because there weren't very many machines. The machines were largely mainframes, although mini computers were just getting going. But no, our dream was that this tool would be an individual productivity tool, and there would be a lot of software that, even though the price would have to be, like $100, we would sell enough that we could afford a gigantic engineering budget and build that software for a global market.
Famous letter to the Homebrew Computer Club when everybody thinks software should be free. We still see that today. People think they should share books, they should share music, whatever. What was your argument that, okay, we can't have everything be open and free that way?
Yeah, I mean, if you look back on the letter now, it seems like sour grapes a little bit, because I didn't realize I would become insanely wealthy off of people paying for software. So the idea that I'm sitting there saying, hey, you guys aren't paying enough, that did get solved. People are buying their software pretty much nowadays, particularly because now it's kind of an ongoing service. You want to get the updates and everything. So it's a new model where you want to connect up and you can track, who's actually using it pretty well. But in those early days, I complained. We wrote this basic interpreter for this kid computer, and people were just passing it around and not buying the software at all.
When you were running Microsoft, when did you feel most out of control, things out of your control?
Well, you're competing in the market, and people announce, their products, and you see, like company Lotus did a spreadsheet called 123. We had a spreadsheet. There was VisiCalc was kind of the first, then Multiplan was second. Then this 123 product, we saw that. It was just so much better than anybody else's. So we canceled our character mode spreadsheet and decided, okay, we'll just do a graphical spreadsheet, which became Excel. And eventually, the story has a happy ending because Excel have people heard of 123? It's now somewhat obscure, even though it was a great product.
Well, one of the things I was thinking of was that period of the antitrust.
Okay, the antitrust lawsuit was the only really negative thing that ever happened to Microsoft. And, we were at the whim of a complex court suit. So yes, I did feel a lack of control.
But yeah, and it's interesting because it allows companies like Google to exist and other things, and now, no?
No, Google, anyway.
All right, okay. There's a part of your biography that hasn't yet been well told, which is the moment you decide to pivot and do philanthropy. Tell me about that decision. Conscious decision, well thought out?
Well, my parents set a great example, both in voluntary time and giving to various organizations. And, they would involve us in terms of, going and packing things for homeless people or taking gifts to other families around Christmas. So I'd had an exposure. My mom and dad were both involved with the United Way that funded social service things. I got that going at Microsoft. But it was only in the 90s where I really started to read about, okay, what was Rockefeller, what was Carnegie, what was Ford, what were Tata Trusts. And by that time, the value of my Microsoft ownership was clearly going to be, large. And so, when Melinda and I were talking about getting married, we talked a lot about, okay, one of the things we'll do together is give this money back to society, and what are we going to give it to? And so we did a lot of learning and reading in the 90s. And then in the year 2000, I made the first gift that made it the largest foundation. And because there's a 5% minimum payout, we had to spend $1 billion a year, was required. And so we got off to a good start.
I don't know how to phrase this well, but I'm asking almost a deeper question, which is why?
Well, there's a lot of interesting things to work on, and being part of the software industry was very interesting. As I got to learn about vaccines and malaria and see how little, because the market doesn't work. People whose children die of malaria have so little money that there isn't the market incentive to invent a malaria vaccine or malaria bed nets. And so when I found those areas, and I was just fascinated, oh man, this is killing millions of children and nothing's being done about it, I found myself being drawn into that. And I didn't want to be, some guy in my 60s trying to run a software company. I just thought, the new things that would go on, the new approaches, someone else should be picked to do that. And I didn't really want to just be, a guy giving advice. I wanted to be leading something, and the foundation work really drew me in to the degree that in 2004, I told Steve Ballmer, who had taken over as CEO in the year 2000, and in 2006 I told the public, and then in 2008 I switched, so Microsoft became a part-time thing, which it still is, and the foundation became the full-time thing. And the foundation work was so engaging, learning about countries and medical things. I've had to learn a lot, which is what I enjoy most.
And you traveled the world incessantly when you started the foundation, and it seems different from almost every foundation. You were really trying to learn new things about what could be most effective.
Yeah, our foundation's an operating foundation. We have 1,800 employees. We've got a malaria team, which is phenomenal, a tuberculosis team, an HIV team, a nutrition team. And we are coordinating a lot of research to solve those problems, in many cases eradicate diseases like polio altogether.
And what are you doing on pandemic right now?
Well, sadly, a foundation can't solve the pandemic thing. It's up to the government. It's just like saying, can a foundation, if there's no fire departments, can a foundation do that? We can do a lot of the development of the new tools, like super cheap diagnostics, that are accurate that you can make billions of a month. We are working on that. Vaccines that protect you for over a decade. Vaccines that are infection blocking so you're not part of a transmission chain. Vaccines that cover all the variants instead of having to keep changing the vaccine.
Wait, let me back up to the ones that are infection blockers, so that how would that work? Because we didn't get it right this time.
Yeah, so the antibodies that these vaccines create are in your blood and they protect your lungs. And the lungs are the primary cause of death from COVID, is the way that you get an overreaction of the immune system in the lungs. And that's, the vaccine avoids that happening. To block getting infected, you have to have a lot of mucosal antibodies up in your upper respiratory tract. And these vaccines generate only a tiny amount of mucosal. What we're seeing is that if your delivery is nasal, where you inhale at least one of the doses, maybe all of the doses, then the immune system decides, okay, I'll create protection at that point of entry.
Well, that would also help because people don't like getting shots, generally.
That's right. Yeah, I think an inhaled vaccine would be good. We are getting rid of the shot. We're going to have a patch. It's called a microarray patch for all vaccines, where you just slap it on your arm, and it's a bunch of little needles, and so there's not the same pain that's associated with today's
But that
vaccine.
wouldn't help with the nasal transmission.
No, that's just to help with the hesitancy and having to make all those syringes. But the route of delivery plus some new adjuvants is how we're going to get the protection. And when you get a measles vaccine, you actually do get full protection. That's
So why is that? Measles is a virus. Why doesn't it?
It's such a powerful. That's a live virus, and so the immune system, when you get your measles shot, you really react very powerfully. And we weren't willing in COVID. There was some concern about using that approach, so it's not
Maybe because it'd be too powerful, it might cut.
it can revert. Understanding when you do these attenuated, will it actually revert back? You have to wait a long time.
And the messenger RNA vaccines that we ended up using mainly, that basically has your, creating a spike protein in the nucleus in your cells, making a spike protein that would not work, it would seem, for a respiratory stopping of transmission.
If you inhale the mRNA, okay, and so that the macrophages in the upper respiratory tract are presenting these things, then you're going to activate the immune system up here. That's what it looks like. So the body's good. The immune system's a miracle.
Although it can be problematic. It's like
all
miracles have some problematic elements.
It's a tuned protection thing that when it makes a mistake, it's called an autoimmune disease. And those are, that includes rheumatoid arthritis, multiple sclerosis, many things. It's kind of calibrated, but it does make mistakes.
Your foundation, when you started, was almost at least a third, maybe more, focused on U.S. education, which ends up being a tougher problem than malaria in many ways. We'll say thank you because Jim Shelton, who was at your foundation back then, and others. After Katrina, we revamped the entire school system here. It is, a school system that's very much involved with innovation, choice, and you help bring it back. But you haven't really cracked the code, it seems, on what we can really do through K through 12 education. Tell me things you're thinking of now.
Yeah, if you're a large foundation, you should have, ambitious goals. So our goal in health was to work with others and get the yearly deaths of children under 5, which was 10 million at the turn of the century, to get that below 5 million. And so we've been successful, and now we understand how to get from 5 million a year to 2.5 million a year. So that's a big statistic. The equivalent in U.S. education would be to have basically, 80% of the kids score in the same place that the top 10% used to score in. And no such miracle has taken place. In fact, math and reading scores in the United States have moved only a tiny bit. you'll have cities like New Orleans or Washington, D.C. or Chicago that were, below the average, and then they'll come up and even get, in some cases, above the average. But there's no systemic thing that anyone's done, not, the fact there's computers around or, charter schools around, none of that.
But if we had a lot of charters and a lot of competition, wouldn't there be more innovation?
Yes, I'm a very pro-charter school person, but the politics are such. I mean, some charter schools are actually not that great, but if we were really good about shutting down the ones that don't deliver on their promise, there are incredible charter schools where they take kids who in the local high school will do very poorly and they do extremely well. And, we study to make sure there's not selection bias. So that movement, which educates about 4% of the kids, has had some success, but not enough to move the average scores.
Over the years, many, many years that I've sort of been talking to you or listening to you or learning from you, you've always been interested in artificial intelligence and whether machines could think and, how we would get there. Suddenly we seem to be on the verge, especially of large language model and natural processing intelligence. Are we on a big breakthrough? What do you think of
Absolutely.
ChatGPT?
No, last year I was challenging the OpenAI guys and the Microsoft guys last June. I said, if you can pass the AP biology test where I make up questions it's never seen before, then it's interesting. Otherwise, it's kind of just goofy. And I thought that would send them away for 3 years so I could, focus on malaria and TB. Within 3 months, they came back and said, you really got to see this thing. So Satya and the OpenAI guys came to dinner at my house and showed me what is now announced as GPT-4. The ChatGPT people are playing with this based on GPT-3, and so this is a generation more. And it is quite phenomenal. And so what we have here is, for the first time, the computer can read and write. The computer could see, the computer could listen, but it could not read a book and do anything except regurgitate what was in the book. And that, representing knowledge in a high-level way and being able to...
How did that happen?
It happened with this basically making the computer guess how to fill words in and understanding through what's called the attention model which words were influencing the correct guess. And so that attention model advances 2017, and then people take that and they scale it up, and there's this emergent capability that I did not predict, that you started to see in GPT-3, and you really see how...
And it kind of feeds on itself after a while, too.
That's right. It's not perfect yet. I mean, it does what's called hallucination sometimes.
But so do we.
And what it's missing is humans know the context of, hey, you're supposed to just make stuff up in some contexts, and in other contexts, you're supposed to give very serious answers. And so the last few months, there's an immense amount of work going on to say to it, no, come on, don't joke around. We're trying to get a medical diagnosis here. There was a demo done to the Microsoft board, and they had it telling jokes, which are so-so. And then one of the board members is involved in the baseball team, so we asked, hey, what about the Mariners? And it just kept making nasty jokes. It didn't realize that the context had changed. It wasn't that hard. But,
it does make good jokes. I've used it, and I think Microsoft is incorporated into Bing ChatGPT 3 already, no?
No, that's 4.
That's 4.
Bing with AI is a thing where we look at what you want, we go out and get lots of information, feed it to the AI, and the AI is the latest AI.
I've been able, through Microsoft, they've given me early access, and we use it in the class the whole time. But the code name for it was Prometheus. And I was, I think that's the code name they were using.
They had multiple code names,
Yeah. And I thought, wait a minute, have they read the myth about snatching technology from the gods? And being punished for it and all. Do you worry that it could turn out like the Prometheus myth and it could be dangerous to society?
Well, all new technology, you can get electrocuted, you can get run over. We have to minimize the negatives and maximize the positives. And whenever you have a new technology, you're not even sure. If a doctor gets advice and then the doctor looks it over very carefully, so it's just making them more productive, that probably could be okay. That's very different than saying, okay, this machine should take over some of the decision making. But we definitely have work to do before you trust it for important decisions. If you're trying to plan a trip to Greece, if you're trying to research a topic, if you're trying to get something summarized, if you're trying to pick a gift, this thing is miraculously better. I mean, just utterly better. And it means natural language. If you use a drawing program, you'll just say, put a bar in there, put the sun there, make those trees different. Natural language will be the primary way we engage with the computer. We'll still be able to point and color and all that kind of stuff. But even like business information programs, you'll just describe what you want in English. You won't have to write Python or C or anything like that. So this really is a threshold that we've just crossed, where computers can read and write.
And do you think that there'll ever come a time when they could almost just leave us behind?
It's likely at some point that silicon intelligence will be able to do a lot of things better than humans, way beyond.
You can always calculate pi to more digits than I can. Yeah.
But that broadens out over time.
Mm-hmm. And here we've got a really thriving innovation community, entrepreneur community. Like all over America, you see it, you don't have to move, as you did, from Albuquerque either to Seattle or Silicon Valley to make it work. And Idea Village in this town is one of the great incubators. Tulane's doing one too. If you were a young entrepreneur now, one of my students, what field would you go into? What type of advice would you give?
Well, I think the sciences broadly, whether it's health sciences, climate sciences, artificial intelligence, if you're inclined to be able to work in one of those sciences, they are pretty profound in terms of giving us big innovations. We need hundreds of innovations to solve climate. We need hundreds of innovations to improve health and not have the health system bankrupt us. As we look at these AIs, they're applicable in health. They're applicable in education. Saul Kahn, who you mentioned, and I have been spending the last 4 months just brainstorming about, okay, how can this work for education? And he's been doing...
You mean how can ChatGPT type
help you, exactly, where it engages you, it understands what you know, what you don't know, and it's helpful, because getting a full-time tutor, not everybody's going to get that. So, we think, even though one of the areas the AI still makes horrendous mistakes in is math. It's very weird. It's actually, its weakest subject is math, and we're working on it. It doesn't...
When you say I'm sorry to interrupt, we're working, are you working, rolling up your sleeves now and working on this?
I'm doing a lot of product reviews. I mean, Satya Nadella, who runs Microsoft and is amazing, loves to have me sit and brainstorm with groups. So, I meet with the security group. Okay, what are we going to do with AI? I meet with the office group. What are we going to do with AI? I meet with the business applications and say, okay, for people who do sales or service, how can this make them 5 times more
So have you
productive?
come back to Microsoft more because of AI?
My time, since that early September demo where they come to my house and it passes the AP biology exam with a 5, then I've put a lot of time in since then, because it is a rare moment where something is changing very dramatically.
And so your advice to Idea Village and other entrepreneurs is if you can connect artificial intelligence to all sorts of fields, whether it be bus schedules or how to make tapestries, that's one of the new lines of...
Yeah, the new horizon there is AI in law, in architecture, in, help doctors, help nurses.
In cooking, I hope.
I don't think it'll invent much new stuff, but it's funny, the robotics will do well, but that's actually gone slower than people expected. The fact that these white-collar jobs are now using the AI and the robots were a little slower, that was not predicted.
Mm-hmm. Well, this is a book festival, so let me end. But first of all, he always takes a book bag on his Think Week, something you've done 40 years maybe, which is, I'm going to just go off a week and think and take a book. So we got a book bag for you. But what are you reading right now?
Howard French wrote a book called Born into Blackness that really explains the role of Africa in modernity in a way that is quite stunning. It's kind of grim because a lot of it's about slavery, cotton, sugar, and those things. Anyway, a really phenomenal book.
Bill Gage, wow, as always, thank you for joining us. Bravo. That was pretty awesome. Yeah, that's great. Like I felt. Yeah, I'll take it. I'll give it to Patrick.